The tent was found on February 26, 1959, on the slope of a mountain in the Ural range of Siberia. It was partially buried under a thin layer of snow. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary abandoned campsite. But when the rescue team got closer, they saw something that changed the nature of everything that followed. The tent had been cut open from the inside, not unzipped, not opened through the entrance, cut with a knife from the interior. The threads of the fabric were pushed outward, which meant the force came from someone inside the tent trying to get out as quickly as possible. The equipment inside was untouched: shoes, coats, food, cameras, a diary with entries up to the day before. Everything a group of experienced hikers would need to survive a night in Siberia in February was sitting inside the tent. The 9 people who had been sleeping in it were not. Leading away from the tent, pressed into the snow, were footprints, some made by boots, some made by bare feet. The footprints moved in a calm, measured pace, not running, not panicked, just walking, away from the tent and down the slope. They continued for approximately 500 meters before the snow covered them. The search for what happened to those 9 people would take 2 months, 65 years, hundreds of investigators, and produce no definitive answer that everyone accepts. Welcome to World Unveiled. This is the Dyatlov Pass incident, the unsolvable mystery of the Mountain of the Dead. On the morning of January 23, 1959, a group of 10 students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute boarded a train heading for the Ural Mountains. They were experienced hikers and skiers. Their leader was a 23-year-old named Igor Dyatlov, who had organized and completed multiple previous expeditions in difficult terrain. The group had 8 men and 2 women. They kept a detailed diary of every day of their journey and photographed everything. One member, Yuri Yudin, became ill with joint pain a few days into the trek and turned back. He was the last person to see the other 9 alive. Before he left, someone took a photograph of the group at the moment of separation. Yudin would carry that photograph and the memory of that moment for the rest of his life. He died of natural causes in 2013 at the age of 76. The only survivor of a group that had set out together on a winter hiking expedition 65 years earlier. The 9 who continued reached the base of the mountain the local Mansi people called Kolet Shasol on February 1st. In the Mansi language, the name means Mountain of the Dead. They spent the entire day climbing and made camp near the summit in the late afternoon, just meters below the top. The last diary entry, written that evening, translated as something like this: "It is difficult to imagine such peace in the mountains, hundreds of kilometers from human settlements, in the face of strong winds." That was the last thing any of them wrote. 16 days after the group's expected return date, with no telegram received and no contact made, a search and rescue team was sent into the mountains. They found the tent on February 26th. They found the first 2 bodies near a cedar tree, in the direction the footprints had been heading, approximately 1.5 kilometers from the tent. The 2 men were wearing only light shirts and underwear, no jackets, no gloves, no boots, no thermal clothing of any kind. The temperature on the night of their deaths had been approximately minus 30 degrees Celsius. The branches of the cedar tree were broken up to 5 meters above the ground, suggesting someone had climbed the tree in the dark, possibly to look for something or get away from something at ground level. A burned-out bonfire was found nearby. 3 more bodies were found between the cedar tree and the tent, positioned as if they had been trying to walk back uphill toward the camp, but collapsed before reaching it. They were slightly better dressed than the first 2, but still missing shoes and gloves. The cause of death for all 5 was officially recorded as hypothermia. Then the last 4 bodies were found in May, buried under several meters of snow approximately 75 meters from the cedar tree in the opposite direction from the tent. These 4 were better dressed, but 3 of them had injuries that the medical examiner described as impossible to explain by human violence or animal attack. 1 had a fractured skull, 2 had multiple broken ribs and severe internal chest injuries. The force required to produce these injuries was compared in the official report to the force of a car crash, and yet there was no impact site. No tree, no rock face, no surface against which a body could have been thrown with that kind of force. 2 of the 4 had their eyes missing. 1 woman was missing her tongue. The official Soviet investigation closed the case on May 28, 1959. The cause of death was listed as hypothermia for 6 of the 9 and unspecified injuries caused by an unknown force for 3. The case was classified and the files were sealed for decades. In the Cold War atmosphere of 1959, this secrecy immediately generated theories. 3 items of clothing recovered from the scene tested positive for radioactivity at levels significantly above normal background radiation. This fueled speculation that the Soviet military had been conducting secret nuclear tests in the area, and that the hikers had been exposed to radiation, that the government was covering up what had really happened, that the hypothermia explanation was a fabrication designed to close a case that implicated military activity. Other theories followed over the decades. A military weapons test gone wrong, a confrontation with escaped prisoners from nearby labor camps, a UFO. The last photograph on one of the cameras showed a blurry orange glow in the darkness, which could have been the bonfire, or the aurora, or a light from the camp, or something that has never been satisfactorily identified. The photograph has been analyzed dozens of times by different researchers and has not yielded a consensus explanation. The most scientifically credible explanation that has emerged from decades of investigation goes like this. On the night of February 1st, the group used a small homemade stove inside the tent to prepare food. The stove had a chimney pipe that vented smoke to the outside. After cooking, the stove was partially extinguished, but smoldering coals remained. At some point during the night, the chimney pipe became blocked or detached, causing carbon monoxide and smoke to fill the sealed interior of the tent. The hikers woke up unable to breathe, confused, possibly already experiencing the neurological effects of carbon monoxide poisoning, which can include disorientation, impaired judgment, and panic. They did not have time or cognitive clarity to find and use the tent's entrance. They cut through the side of the fabric with a knife and got out. Burn marks found on some of the bodies and clothing, and blood coming from the mouths of some hikers, which is consistent with inhalation of large quantities of unfiltered smoke, support this theory. Once outside in minus 30-degree air, some without proper clothing, they moved calmly because the immediate threat, the smoke, was gone. They knew there was a cedar tree further down the slope where they had passed earlier and where they could build a fire and shelter. Some of them went to the tree. Others tried to go back to the tent for their equipment and clothing, but collapsed from hypothermia before they could make the climb. The 4 who went further into the forest in search of firewood were caught by a small, localized snowslide from a rock face above them, which caused the crushing injuries that looked so inexplicable in isolation. Rocks and compacted snow moving at speed can produce the same forces as a car impact without leaving the kind of obvious scene that human violence or a large avalanche would create. The radioactive clothing belonged to 2 specific members of the group. One worked at a nuclear facility, one worked at a classified Soviet nuclear production plant. Their clothing would have carried radiation from their workplace. So, the missing eyes and tongue of the hikers found in May were consistent with decomposition and scavenging by small animals during the months the bodies were buried under snow, not with deliberate mutilation. Every element of the mystery has an explanation. The explanations are individually plausible, but they have never been assembled into a single account that every researcher accepts. And the Soviet-era secrecy that surrounded the initial investigation made it permanently impossible to verify what the original investigators actually found and what they chose not to report. The Dyatlov Pass incident has been open for 65 years. More than 100 expeditions have visited the site. The Russian government reopened the investigation in 2019 and closed it again in 2020 with the conclusion that a small avalanche was responsible, a conclusion that the families of the victims and many independent researchers rejected. The mountain is still there. The cedar tree is still there. The answers are still somewhere in the gap between what the evidence shows and what the evidence proves. This is World Unveiled. Subscribe, because some mysteries are not unsolvable, they are just unsolved.